The first thing he heard was the boots, not running walking. Slow, confident, leather soles pressing into wet earth with the steady rhythm of men who knew they owned this road. Each step landed like a countdown in his chest. 1, 2, 3. Close enough now that he could hear metal shifting rifle slings creaking, a canteen knocking softly against a belt buckle. Someone coughed. Another voice murmured a word he didn't understand, but the tone was casual, relaxed, the sound of hunters who believed the animal had nowhere left to go. The soldier lay frozen in the shallow ditch, his cheek pressed into cold mud, rainwater soaking through his uniform. He didn't dare blink, didn't dare breathe too deeply. The hedge above him was too thin. He knew it. He had known it the moment he slid in here, heart pounding, lungs burning, telling himself it would be enough. It wasn't from where. The patrol stood. One careless glance downward would reveal his helmet, his shoulder, the faint tremor in the leaves where his body refused to be still. He had already tried everything. Running had bought him minutes, not miles. Hiding had narrowed his world to this ditch, this strip of darkness. Fighting was a fantasy one-man, low on ammunition, against a full patrol. He replayed the map in his mind, the one that was now useless. The friendly lines were too far. The terrain too open. Every path out led straight through them. A boot stopped Dot. So close now he could smell tobacco and damp wool. The voices paused. A shadow stretched across the ditch, cutting off what little moonlight remained. His fingers tightened around his rifle, though he knew raising it would only buy him a second before the world erupted in gunfire. His heart slammed so hard he was certain they could hear it. Any moment now, someone would look down. Any moment, the shout would ring out. Hond ho, fewer, the end. This was supposed to be the moment everything ended. Strangely, what filled his mind wasn't fear anymore, it was clarity. A cold, sharp awareness that this was the last decision he would ever make. He understood. Something then, with terrifying certainty, if he did what made sense, he would die. If he did what he had been trained to do, he would die. Survival no longer lived in logic. It lived somewhere else entirely. His eyes shifted, just slightly, taking in the patrol's formation. Their spacing, the way their attention flowed forward instead of down. He noticed details that felt absurd to notice now, the way one man laughed quietly at a joke, the way another adjusted his helmet strap. Ordinary moments, unfolding inches from his death, and then the thought came, it was wrong. Instinctively wrong. The kind of idea that would get a man court-martialed in training or shot on the spot in the field. His pulse spiked, not with fear, this time, but disbelief. No, that was insane. That would never work. He almost dismissed it immediately. The boot shifted again. A voice called out, sharper now. Someone was about to look down. The soldier swallowed, mud on his lips, and made a decision that defied every rule he had ever learned about staying alive. Instead of shrinking deeper into the darkness, he moved, and in that single, impossible moment when hiding was no longer an option and surrender meant death, he did the last thing the enemy patrol would ever expect. Hours earlier, he had not been alone. He was a private first class from a small farming town that barely appeared on most maps, the kind of place where everyone knew your last name before they knew your first. He wasn't famous. He wasn't decorated. He hadn't even been in the war very long. Barely enough time to learn which sounds on the battlefield meant danger and which ones meant it was already too late. His unit had landed in Europe with the same mixture of confidence and quiet fear that clung to most young soldiers trained hard, briefed well, and still painfully aware that no amount of preparation could fully explain what waited beyond the front line. The operation was supposed to be routine. A coordinated push meant to probe enemy defenses, gather intelligence, and fall back before dawn. Nothing heroic. Nothing that would make it into newspapers back home. Move in under cover of darkness, identify positions, avoid engagement if possible. The kind of mission where success meant nothing happened at all. But war never cared about plans. The night was darker than expected, clouds swallowing what little moonlight there was. Radios crackled with half-heard commands. Someone tripped Flare farther down the line, turning shadows into chaos. Orders changed mid-movement. Units shifted left when they should have gone right. In the confusion, the private followed what he thought was his squad only to realize, minutes later, that the shapes ahead of him were moving too quickly. Too quietly. By the time he understood the mistake, it was too late to call out. He dropped. Low, heart hammering, watching figures pass within yards of him. Enemy soldiers. Close enough that he could make out their silhouettes, their weapons, the disciplined way they moved. He stayed still for what felt like hours, waiting for his unit to reappear. They never did. The battlefield had swallowed them whole, leaving him in a pocket of darkness that no longer belonged to either side. He didn't panic, not yet. Instead, he did something small, almost trivial, that said more about him than any metal ever could. He took a breath, counted, listened. He remembered a sergeant once saying that panic was louder than gunfire if you let it be. So he moved when it felt right, not when fear told him to. He avoided open ground, doubled back when something felt wrong, even when logic said to push forward. But luck has limits. At some point in the night, he realized the sounds around him had changed. Fewer distant explosions. More voices, closer. Organized. A patrol pattern, not random movement. He was no longer near the edge of the fight, he was behind it. Every step he took now carried him deeper into territory he did not control. He considered hiding until daylight, but the ground offered no real cover. He thought about moving anyway, trusting speed over stealth, but the patrol routes tightened like a noose. With each passing minute, the enemy presence grew more confident, more deliberate, and somewhere in the dark, as boots began to echo closer and closer, the private understood a terrible truth. This wasn't about finding his way back anymore. It was about surviving long enough to make a choice no one had trained him to make. They moved like men who had done this before. The patrol wasn't large, 6, maybe 7 soldiers, but their spacing was precise, their pace measured. No one bunched up, no one lagged behind. Rifles were carried at the ready, not slung, not resting casually against shoulders. These weren't nervous recruits sweeping an area out of fear. They were professionals sent out with a purpose, and they moved through the countryside as if it already belonged to them. The private watched them from a patch of brush no thicker than a curtain, his body folded in on itself, knees drawn tight to his chest. Through gaps in the leaves he could see their faces, now hard, alert, eyes scanning the ground as much as the horizon. A non-commissioned officer walked near the center, occasionally raising a hand to slow the group, listening. Every few steps, one of them paused to study the earth, the hedgerows, the shallow ditches that crisscrossed the land. They were tracking something. Or someone. Him. Earlier that night, farther down the line, a sentry had found signs of movement where there shouldn't have been any. Broken twigs, fresh boot prints half hidden by mud. Enough to raise concern, not enough to confirm. That was all it took. This patrol had been sent out not to search blindly, but to confirm a suspicion. And suspicion in war sharpened men into weapons. The private's mouth went dry. His thoughts no longer formed in clean sentences. They came in fragments, distances, directions, half-remembered advice. Don't silhouette yourself. Stay downwind. Watch their eyes, not their guns. He repeated these rules like prayers, even as he felt them slipping, one by one. Out of reach, a sudden voice broke the silence. One of the patrol had stopped just short of his hiding place, kneeling to examine the ground. The private squeezed. His eyes shut, then forced them open again. The man's helmet was only a few feet away now, close enough that he could see rain clinging to the rim, close enough that he could hear the slow rhythm of breathing. The soldier's gloved hand hovered over the mud, fingers brushing dangerously near a fresh indentation. A mark left by the private's knee when he had shifted his. Wait minutes earlier, time stretched. Every instinct screamed at him to move, to strike, to do something, anything, but he remained still, teeth clenched so tightly his jaw ached. The patrolman frowned, studying the ground, then glanced up toward the hedgerow. For one unbearable second, his gaze drifted directly toward the private's position. A flare went up in the distance, not close enough to illuminate them, but close enough to distract. The patrolman cursed softly and stood, gesturing for the group to move. The moment passed. The private sagged inward, relief crashing through him so hard it nearly made him lightheaded. He had survived by chance alone, but chance was running out. The patrol adjusted its pattern after that. They spread wider, flanking the hedgerows, probing ditches instead of skirting them. Twice more, the private was forced to shift position as they drew too close. Each movement cost him something: breath, balance, precious composure. His hands shook now, no matter how tightly he clenched them. Sweat ran cold down his spine despite the night air. He began to lose track of time. Minutes blurred into something longer, heavier. His thoughts turned dark, intrusive. He imagined the shout when he was found. The sharp crack of a rifle, the weight of boots around his body. He wondered if anyone would ever know what happened to him, or if he would simply vanish into a report marked missing, presumed dead. At one point, he almost laughed. The absurdity of it struck him suddenly, that all the training, all the Martian drills had led him here, crouched in the dirt, undone by a patrol that moved like clockwork. He bit down on the inside of his cheek to keep from making a sound. Pain anchored him, but only barely. Then the net closed. The patrol halted again, this time in a loose semicircle that cut off his last viable escape route. The non-commissioned officer whispered orders, pointing, assigning positions. 2 men moved to the far side of the hedgerow. Another stepped closer to the ditch, rifle angled downward. They were done circling. Now they were compressing. The private's chest tightened. He knew this pattern. He had seen it used before on the other side. It was how you fleshed out what didn't belong. His mind raced through the terrain, but there was nowhere left to go. No deeper cover. No shadows thick enough to disappear into. The ditch behind him ended in open ground. The brush ahead would betray him the moment he moved. He was surrounded by men who were patient, alert, and increasingly certain. As the nearest soldier took a step forward, boots sinking into the mud of the ditch's edge, the private understood, with brutal clarity, that this was no longer a near miss. This was the moment the patrol should have caught him. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It crept in, slow and heavy, like water seeping through cracks. Hiding was over. The private felt it in the way the patrol's movements changed, in the way their pauses grew longer and their spacing tighter. They weren't searching anymore. They were confirming. Every breath he took felt borrowed. Every second he stayed still only narrowed the space around him. If he remained where he was, discovery wasn't a possibility. It was a certainty waiting for its turn. He closed his eyes and forced himself to think, not pray. Not hope? Think. His mind ran through the options anyway, even though he already knew the answer. Run? He pictured it clearly. The first step, the shout, the muzzle flashes, tearing the darkness apart. Fight? 1 man against a half-circle of rifles? It wouldn't even be a fight. Surrender? He dismissed it instantly. He had seen what happened to men captured this deep behind the lines. Survival didn't live there either. The silence pressed in thick enough to choke on. Then his thoughts began to drift to places they had no right to go. Not tactics, not drills, but memories. A childhood dare he'd accepted just to prove he could. A card trick he'd once practiced until his fingers bled. Not because it mattered, but because no one believed he could pull it off. A sergeant's voice, months ago, laughing as he said, "Sometimes the dumbest idea is the one that keeps you alive." The private almost shook his head, as if he could dislodge the thought forming there. No, that was ridiculous. The idea felt wrong the moment it surfaced. It didn't fit into any rule he had been taught. It required him to stop behaving like prey and do something far more dangerous, something visible, something active. His pulse spiked at the mere suggestion of it. He imagined the patrol's reaction, the way fingers would tighten on triggers the instant he moved. His stomach twisted. If he tried this and failed, he wouldn't even have the dignity of surprise. He would be standing when the shots came, seen, exposed. There would be no doubt about what happened next. But if he didn't try it? A boot scraped against stone. The nearest soldier was close enough now that the private could see the outline of his rifle barrel, angled down toward the ditch. Another step, maybe two, and the game would be over. The private's thoughts sharpened. Fear stripping away everything that didn't matter. He realized something then. Something simple and terrifying. The patrol was confident because they believed. They understood the situation. They believed the danger in front of them would behave a certain way. Run, hide, fight, or beg. They were prepared for all of it. Their discipline, their formation, their patience, it all relied on that assumption. On predictability, the idea returned, stronger now. What if he became something they weren't looking for? His heart hammered so loudly he was sure it would give him away. He could feel the tremor in his hands, the fine motor control slipping. He pressed his palms into the mud, grounding himself. This wasn't bravery. He knew that. Bravery was acting. Despite fear, this was something else entirely. This was choosing a different kind of fear, the fear of looking insane, of being misunderstood, of stepping into the open with no guarantee the enemy would hesitate. A voice whispered from the darkness. Closer now. A command, quiet but firm. The private inhaled slowly through his nose, then exhaled, once, twice. He rehearsed it in his head, not the details, just the intention. He didn't need it to work perfectly. He just needed it to disrupt, to confuse, to buy seconds where there were none left to buy. The soldier in front shifted his weight, preparing to step down into the ditch. That was it. The private's fear reached a breaking point and flipped. In its place came a strange, almost detached calm. The kind that arrives when there are no good options left, only choices. He understood with absolute clarity that this was the last chance he would get to control the story of what happened. Next, he opened his eyes fully, and instead of shrinking back into the mud, he prepared to rise ready to gamble his life on an idea no training manual would ever dare to teach. He rose slowly, deliberately, as if he belonged there. The mud clung to his uniform as he stood, water dripping from his sleeves, helmet tilted just enough to cast his face in shadow. For half a heartbeat, the world seemed to freeze. The patrolman stared, startled not by movement alone, but by the wrongness of it. Men didn't stand up in places like this. They bolted, they fired, they begged. They didn't step out of hiding like actors walking onto a stage. The private lifted his hands, but not high, not in surrender. Just enough to be seen. Then he did something that made his own blood run cold. He spoke. Not in English. The words came out clipped and harsh, pulled from overheard phrases, from shouted orders he had memorized without meaning to. His accent was imperfect, but confidence carried it forward. He barked a command, sharp and annoyed, the tone of someone irritated at incompetence rather than afraid of death. At the same time, he slapped his thigh and gestured broadly toward the far hedgerow, away from his position, as if pointing out a mistake. For a fraction of a second, no one moved. The patrol's rifles wavered, muzzles dipping, not lowered, but no longer fixed on him. Confusion rippled through them like a gust of wind through tall grass. The non-commissioned officer frowned, eyes narrowing, trying to place what he was seeing. A lone soldier emerging from a ditch, issuing orders instead of surrendering. It didn't fit the pattern their minds were trained to expect. The private didn't give them time to think. He took a step forward, boots squelching loudly in the mud, and continued speaking faster now, sharper, layering frustration over authority. He pointed again, more insistently this time, jabbing his finger toward the distant field. He shook his head as if disgusted by their mistake, as if they were the ones who had blundered. One of the patrolmen glanced where he pointed. Another followed. That was all it took. The private's heart threatened to tear itself free from his chest, but his face remained hard, almost bored. Inside, every nerve screamed. One wrong word, one wrong inflection. If any of them stepped closer, if any of them demanded clarification, the illusion would collapse instantly. A soldier at the edge of the formation raised his rifle again, uncertainty. Tightening his grip, the private snapped his head toward him and shouted louder now, angrier. The sound echoed off the hedgerows, carrying farther than he intended. For a terrifying moment, he realized what he'd done. If there were more enemy nearby, he had just announced himself to all of them. The non-commissioned officer barked something. Back, the private caught only part of it, but it didn't matter. The tone was questioning, not commanding. That was the crack in the wall. He leaned into it, answering immediately, gesturing emphatically toward the field again. Then sweeping his arm in a wide arc as if outlining a larger movement, he made. It seemed urgent, time-sensitive, a mistake that needed correcting now. A patrolman muttered something under his breath. Another adjusted his pack, already half-turned. The private's vision tunneled. He could hear his own pulse roaring in his ears. He noticed absurd details, the way a helmet strap had come loose on one soldier, the mud caked on another's boots. He kept talking, even as his throat went dry, relying on rhythm and tone more than words. Authority wasn't about perfect language. It was about momentum. Then everything nearly fell apart. The soldier closest to him took a step forward, suspicion sharpening his features. He said something short and pointed, eyes flicking to the private's uniform, lingering a fraction too long. The private froze inwardly. He had forgotten his insignia, his gear, details that might not match up under scrutiny. This was it. He leaned in slightly, invading the man's space, and cut him off mid-sentence with a sharp, dismissive gesture. He snapped another order, louder than necessary, and turned his body sideways, already beginning to move in the direction he'd been pointing, as if the conversation was over. As if obedience was assumed, for one endless second, no one moved. Then the non-commissioned officer made a decision. He gestured sharply, and the patrol shifted, 2 men turning toward the field, scanning, stepping away from the ditch. The formation loosened, attention redirecting, the mental picture in their heads rewriting itself. They hadn't caught a lone enemy soldier. They had interrupted something else. Something bigger. The private felt his knees threaten to buckle, but he didn't stop. He took another step. Then another, still talking, still gesturing, guiding their attention farther and farther away from the place where he had nearly died. The patrol began to move, boots crunching softly as they advanced in the new direction, weapons raised toward a threat that did not exist, only when their backs fully turned, when the distance between them widened just enough. Did the truth sink in? The patrol was leaving. They were walking away from him, and as the sounds of their boots faded into the darkness, the private stood alone, shaking violently, knowing that the most dangerous part of his gamble wasn't over. Yet, not by a long shot. He didn't move right away. Even after the patrol disappeared into the darkness, even after the last whisper of boots faded into nothing, the private remained exactly where he was standing, in the open arms hanging. At his sides, breath trapped somewhere high in his chest. His body hadn't caught up to reality yet. It still believed that if he moved, if he exhaled too loudly, the world would snap back into place and punish him for daring to exist. Only when his legs began to tremble uncontrollably did he lower himself back into the ditch. He pressed his helmet into the mud and waited. 30 seconds. A minute too. He listened for voices, for orders shouted in anger, for the unmistakable sound of men realizing they'd been fooled. Nothing came. The night swallowed the patrol whole, carrying them farther and farther away from the place they should have stayed. When he finally allowed himself to breathe, it came out in a broken gasp that hurt his throat. He didn't celebrate. He didn't smile. What he felt wasn't triumph. It was shock. A hollow, disbelieving quiet that settled over him as the enormity of what had just happened began to sink in. He had spoken his way out of a firing squad. He had stepped into the open and bent an enemy patrol's attention away from him, using nothing but confidence and timing, and he was still alive. The private didn't waste that life. He moved cautiously at first, slipping out of the ditch and back into the hedgerows, retracing his steps only long enough to put distance between himself and the patrol's new direction. Every shadow made his heart jump. Every rustle of leaves felt like a footstep. But as the minutes passed and no alarm sounded, his pace quickened. He followed the land the way he had been taught: low ground, broken lines of sight, routes that offered options instead of dead ends. By the time the sky began to lighten at the edges, exhaustion hit him like a wave. His legs burned, his hands were raw. His throat ached from whispering orders that no one had been meant to obey. Still, he kept moving, guided now by a distant sound he hadn't dared hope to hear before. Friendly voices. He stopped at the edge of a shallow rise and watched, heart hammering. As silhouettes emerged on the other side helmets he recognized, rifles carried in a way that felt familiar. He stepped out slowly, hands raised for a different reason this time, and called out in a voice that cracked despite his efforts to steady it. The reaction was instant. Weapons came up. Shouts followed. He dropped to his knees before anyone could tell him to, the weight of the night finally crashing down on him all at once. When they reached him and recognized his unit markings, the tension broke into disbelief. "Where the hell have you been?" someone demanded. He didn't have an answer. That made sense. Back behind the lines, the story spread quickly but not loudly. There were no cheers, no grand retellings, just quiet looks exchanged between soldiers who understood how close he'd come to not returning at all. A lieutenant listened as the private explained, haltingly, what he'd done. There was a long pause afterward, the kind that made him wonder if he'd gone too far, crossed some invisible line. Finally, the officer exhaled slowly. "That shouldn't have worked." He said, "No, sir," the private replied, but it had. Only later did the full weight of it become clear. The diverted patrol hadn't just walked away from him, it had shifted its focus entirely. Another element, moving through the same sector under cover of darkness, reached its objective without interference. Supplies moved. Messages got through. Lives continued on paths that might have ended differently if a single patrol had gone the way it was supposed to. No report would ever list his name. Next to those outcomes, the private sat alone after dawn, cleaning the mud from his rifle, with hands that still shook. He replayed the moment again and again, not with pride, but with awe and a quiet fear of how thin the line had been. How easily one wrong word, one suspicious glance, could have ended everything. He understood something now that he hadn't before: survival. In war wasn't always about strength or firepower. Sometimes it was about understanding people, how they thought, what they expected, and how much they relied on the world making sense. That night, the world hadn't made sense, and because of that he was still alive, but as the sun climbed higher, and the noise of the war returned, the private couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part of the story wasn't behind him yet, that the meaning of what he'd done was still waiting to catch up. Long after the mud dried on his uniform, and the night blurred into memory, the private struggled to explain what had happened. There was no manual for it, no doctrine that could neatly label the choice he made. Even he wasn't sure whether it had been courage, instinct, or something closer to desperation masquerading as confidence. All he knew was that, in a moment when logic pointed only toward death, he had stepped sideways into uncertainty and found space to survive. That is how wars are often changed, not by the speeches delivered far from the front, or the arrows drawn across maps in quiet rooms, but by individuals forced into impossible corners, making decisions no one could have planned for. World War II was shaped by grand strategies and massive armies, yes, but it was also shaped by lone soldiers. In the dark, listening to footsteps and choosing to act when every rule said not to. The line between madness and brilliance is thin in war. Too thin to measure until after the fact. What looks reckless in hindsight can be the only option in the moment. The private understood that now. He had felt that line under his boots, had balanced on it while armed men decided his fate. The difference between survival and a shallow grave hadn't been strength or speed. It had been perception, his understanding of how the enemy saw the world, and his willingness to break that picture apart. He never spoke about it much afterward. There were no medals for confusion, no citations for pretending to be something you weren't. His story lived on quietly, in the spaces between official histories, carried forward by those who understood what it meant to be human under unbearable pressure. And that is why the moment still matters, because it reminds us that resilience doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it sounds like a shaky voice speaking the wrong language in the right way at exactly the right time. It reminds us that even in the most brutal conflicts, survival can hinge on creativity, nerve, and the refusal to accept that the story is already over. On that night behind enemy lines, one soldier proved something simple and enduring. When escape is impossible, the human mind can still find a way out, and sometimes that makes all the difference.